The morning sun was barely up when 17-year-old Maya stepped off the bus. She clutched her violin case like it was the most precious thing in the world, because to her, it was. This worn leather case held more than just an instrument. It held 3 years of dreams, countless sleepless nights, and every hope she'd ever had about her future. The Richter Music Conservatory stood before her like a castle from a fairy tale. Tall stone walls, massive windows that sparkled in the early light, and gardens that looked too perfect to be real. Maya had seen pictures online, but nothing prepared her for how grand it actually was. Her small town had one music teacher who worked out of his garage. This place had an entire building just for string instruments. She'd traveled 300 miles to get here. Her parents had saved for months to afford the bus ticket. Her mom packed her sandwiches at 5 in the morning before leaving for her shift at the diner. Her dad slipped $40 into her pocket when he thought she wasn't looking. They believed in her even when she wasn't sure she believed in herself. Maya walked through the main entrance, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors. Other students rushed past her, looking confident and expensive in their tailored clothes. She glanced down at her own outfit, a simple dress her grandmother had helped her pick out. Suddenly, she felt very small. The audition schedule was posted on a large board in the lobby. Her name was there. Maya Chen. 2 o'clock, main concert hall. Her stomach did a flip. She had 4 hours to wait. She found a bench in a quiet corner and opened her violin case. Just looking at the instrument calmed her nerves a little. It wasn't fancy or new. The varnish was worn in places where her chin had rested against it thousands of times. But it had a warm, rich sound that her teacher said was rare for a violin in this price range. Maya practiced her finger positions without actually playing, moving silently through the piece she'd prepared. Paganini's Caprice No. 24. Her teacher had warned her it was too ambitious. "That's a piece for concert masters," he'd said. "Maybe choose something safer for your audition." But Maya wanted to show them what she could do. She wanted them to see that she wasn't just another student looking for an easy path. The hours crawled by. She watched other auditioners come and go. Some looked relieved when they emerged from the concert hall. Others looked crushed, crying quietly as they packed up their instruments. One girl walked out with a huge smile, practically floating. Maya tried not to let it affect her focus, but her anxiety kept building. At 1:45, a stern woman with a clipboard called her name. Maya followed her down a long corridor lined with portraits of famous musicians. She recognized some of them from her music history books. Beethoven, Mozart, Bach. They all seemed to be staring at her, judging whether she belonged here. The concert hall doors were enormous, made of dark wood with brass handles. The woman pushed them open and Maya's breath caught in her throat. The room was bigger than her entire school gymnasium. Rows of empty red velvet seats stretched back into shadows. A crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting warm light across everything. And there, in the center, was a stage with a single chair and music stand. Behind a long table sat 4 people. 3 of them were looking through papers, making notes, barely glancing up as she entered. But the 4th person commanded her attention immediately, Maestro Victor Rostov. She recognized him from the conservatory website. He was a legend in the classical music world. Trained in Moscow, performed in every major concert hall across Europe, and now he taught at Richter. His silver hair was swept back from his face and his dark eyes seemed to see right through her. He sat with his arms crossed, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Maya's legs felt like jelly as she walked toward the stage. The distance from the doors to the performance area seemed to stretch forever. Her violin case suddenly felt twice as heavy. She climbed the steps and stood under the lights. The heat from them made her forehead prickle with sweat. She could see the judges clearly now, but they were far enough away that their expressions were hard to read. "Name and piece." The maestro's voice cut through the silence like a knife. He didn't look up from his papers. He sounded bored, like he'd already heard 100 auditions today and hers would be no different. Maya cleared her throat. "Maya Chen. I'll be performing Paganini's Caprice No. 24. Her voice came out stronger than she expected. Good. At least she didn't sound as terrified as she felt. That got his attention. Maestro Rostov's head snapped up. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she held his gaze. She'd come too far to back down now. Paganini. He said the name slowly, like he was testing whether she understood what she'd just claimed. Do you have any idea how many talented musicians have destroyed their careers attempting that piece? He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. What makes you think you're capable? The question hung in the air between them. Maya opened her mouth to respond, to explain her years of practice, her passion for the piece, her teacher's guidance. But before she could form the words, Maestro Rostov waved his hand dismissively. Never mind, he said, settling back in his chair. Begin. Let's get this over with. Maya stood there for a moment, stunned by his rudeness. Her teacher had warned her that Maestro Rostov was tough, but she hadn't expected such open contempt. She wanted to defend herself, to prove she wasn't wasting his time, but there was only one way to do that. She opened her violin case with trembling fingers, lifted out her instrument, and positioned it under her chin. The familiar weight of it steadied her. She'd played this piece hundreds of times. She knew every note, every shift, every challenge it presented. She could do this. Maya took a deep breath, raised her bow, and began to play. Maya poured everything she had into that performance. Her eye, too. Fingers flew across the strings, hitting each note exactly where it needed to be. She'd practiced this piece so many times that her hands knew the movements by heart. Every shift, every position change, every difficult passage had been drilled into her muscle memory through thousands of repetitions. She thought about all those late nights in her bedroom, playing quietly so she wouldn't wake her parents, the calluses on her fingertips that had built up over years, the way her shoulder ached after long practice sessions. All of it had been leading to this moment. The piece demanded everything from a violinist. Fast runs that tested speed and precision, high notes that required perfect intonation, sudden changes in dynamics that showed emotional range. Maya executed each challenge with the technical skill she'd worked so hard to develop. She didn't miss a single note. As she played, she tried to read the judges' faces. The 3 assistant judges seemed engaged, nodding occasionally and making notes on their papers. That had to be a good sign, right? But Maestro Rostov remained completely still. His expression gave away nothing. He could have been listening to a masterpiece or watching paint dry. There was no way to tell. Maya reached the final section, the part that always made her nervous. Her bow danced across the strings in rapid succession, creating a flurry of notes that seemed almost impossible to play. But she'd practiced this section more than any other. Her fingers knew exactly where to go. The last note rang out clear and true. Maya held her position for a moment, letting the sound fade naturally. Then she lowered her violin and waited. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Sweat trickled down her back despite the air conditioning in the hall. Silence filled the massive room. It stretched on for what felt like forever. The 3 assistant judges leaned toward each other, whispering quietly. One of them nodded. Another wrote something down quickly. Were they impressed? Disappointed? Maya couldn't tell. Then Maestro Rostov stood up. The movement was so sudden and deliberate that everyone else fell silent. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just stood there, looking at her with those piercing dark eyes. Technically proficient, he began. Maya's heart leaped. That was good, right? Technically proficient meant she'd played it correctly. Maybe she had a chance after all. Maybe all those hours of practice had paid off. But then he continued, and her hope shattered like glass. But completely soulless. The words hit her like a physical blow. Maya felt her face flush hot with shame. Maestro Rostov walked a few steps closer to the stage. His voice grew louder, filling the hall. You play the notes like a robot following instructions, like someone reading a recipe from a cookbook. There's no emotion, no connection, no understanding of what Paganini was actually trying to express when he wrote this piece. Maya's hands went numb. She nearly dropped her violin. This couldn't be happening. She'd played it perfectly. Every note had been right. How could that be soulless? The maestro wasn't finished. He paced slowly, his hands gesturing as he spoke. You rely too heavily on sight reading and muscle memory. You've memorized the finger positions. You've practiced the movements until they're automatic. But you haven't truly listened to the music, you haven't felt it. He stopped pacing and looked directly at her. If I were to take away your sheet music right now, if I removed all those carefully practiced finger positions you've memorized, if I took away all your visual cues, he paused for effect. If I were to blindfold you right here on this stage, you would fail spectacularly. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Maya felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She blinked rapidly, trying to hold them back. She wouldn't cry in front of him. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Music isn't something you see, young lady, Maestro Rostov continued, his voice softer now but somehow more cutting. It's something you feel. It lives here. He tapped his chest. Not here, he tapped his temple. Until you understand that difference, you'll never be more than mediocre. One of the assistant judges cleared her throat uncomfortably. Another shifted in his seat. They looked embarrassed by the harsh criticism, but nobody spoke up to defend Maya. Nobody questioned the maestro's judgment. He shook his head slowly, like a disappointed parent. I'm sorry, Miss Chen, but you're not ready for this conservatory, perhaps. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. Perhaps you should reconsider whether music is truly your calling. There are many other paths in life. Not everyone is meant to be a musician. The finality in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just a rejection. It was a dismissal of everything she'd worked for. 3 years of sacrifice, of choosing practice over parties, of missing school events because she had to work on her technique, all of it meaningless in his eyes. Maya stood frozen on that stage, unable to move or speak. The bright lights suddenly felt too hot. The vast concert hall seemed to be closing in on her. Her vision blurred as tears threatened to spill over. She thought about her parents back home, probably sitting by the phone waiting for her call. They'd want to know how it went. They'd ask if she got in. What was she supposed to tell them? That their sacrifice had been for nothing? That their daughter wasn't good enough? She thought about her teacher, the old man who'd believed in her from the start. He'd given her discounted lessons when her family couldn't afford full price. He'd stayed late countless evenings to help her prepare for this audition. How could she face him now? The other judges were gathering their papers, clearly ready to move on to the next audition. Maestro Rostov had already turned away, reaching for his coffee cup. The dismissal was complete. She was supposed to pack up her violin and leave quietly, but something inside Maya refused to accept it. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the memory of her mother's tired smile as she'd packed those sandwiches at dawn. Whatever it was, it made her speak when she should have stayed silent, please. Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, cracking with emotion. Please give me one more chance. The words seemed to echo in the sudden stillness. Maestro Rostov stopped mid-reach for his coffee. The other judges looked up in surprise. Students didn't challenge his decisions. Nobody questioned Maestro Victor Rostov. He turned back slowly, his eyebrows raised. For the first time that afternoon, he looked genuinely surprised. Miss Chen, he said carefully, I don't believe you understand. The audition is over. But Maya was already speaking again, her voice growing stronger. You said I rely on sight and muscle memory. You said I would fail if I were blindfolded. She took a deep breath, hardly believing what she was about to propose. Let me prove you wrong. The silence that followed Maya's words was deafening. She couldn't believe she'd just said that out loud. Her heart hammered in her chest as she watched Maestro Rostov's face for any reaction. Had she just made everything worse? Was he about to throw her out for being disrespectful? The maestro studied her for a long moment. His dark eyes seemed to be looking past her surface, trying to figure out what kind of person would dare to challenge him like this. Students came here hoping to impress him, not to argue with his judgments. Yet here she was, this young girl from a small town, refusing to accept defeat. You want me to blindfold you? He asked slowly, as if making sure he'd heard correctly. Right now? Here on this stage? Maya's throat felt dry, but she forced herself to nod. Yes, sir. Let me play again blindfolded. The same piece or any piece you choose. If I fail, I'll leave without another word. I promise. But if I succeed... She let the possibility hang in the air, afraid to put it into actual words. One of the assistant judges, a woman with gray hair pulled into a tight bun, leaned forward. Victor, this is highly irregular, she said quietly. We have a schedule to maintain. There are other students waiting, but Maestro Rostov held up his hand, silencing her. He was still looking at Maya with that intense, searching gaze. Something had shifted in his expression. Was it curiosity? Or maybe a hint of respect for her courage? Whatever it was, Maya clung to it like a lifeline. You realize what you're asking? He said, walking toward the stage. You want to gamble your entire future on this single moment? If you fail, and you most certainly will, this audition is over. No second chances. No appeals. You'll go home and that will be the end of it. Maya's hands were shaking so badly she had to press them against her sides. Everything in her wanted to back down, to apologize for speaking out of turn, to just accept the rejection and leave with whatever dignity she had left. But she thought about that 300-mile bus ride home. She thought about facing her parents, her teacher, herself. Could she live with the regret of not trying one more time? I understand, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'm ready. The maestro reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a silk scarf. It was dark blue, the kind of elegant accessory someone like him would carry. He climbed the steps to the stage, his shoes clicking against the wood. As he got closer, Maya could see the lines around his eyes, the weariness that came from years of teaching. He stood in front of her, holding the scarf. For a moment, his expression softened just slightly. You have courage, Miss Chen. Misguided, perhaps, but courage nonetheless. His voice was quieter now, almost kind. Are you absolutely certain about this? Maya nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her whole body felt like it was vibrating with nervous energy. Very well. Maestro Rostov stepped behind her. Close your eyes, Maya obeyed. She felt the soft silk slide across her face as he tied the scarf gently but securely around her head. The world went completely dark. Suddenly, the concert hall seemed 10 times bigger. She could hear every tiny sound. The slight rustle of papers from the judge's table, someone's quiet breathing, the hum of the air conditioning system she hadn't noticed before. Without her vision, Maya felt completely exposed and vulnerable. She couldn't see where the judges were sitting. She couldn't see her violin or the bow in her hands. She couldn't even see her own fingers. All those visual references she'd relied on her entire life were gone. Can you see anything? Maestro Rostov asked. No, sir. Nothing. Good. He moved around to face her, and she could sense his presence even though she couldn't see him. Now listen very carefully. You're going to play the same piece, Paganini's Caprice No. 24, but this time I want you to forget everything you think you know about performing. He paused, and Maya heard him take a few steps away. His voice came from further back now, maybe from the edge of the stage. Don't play for me. Don't play to get into this conservatory. Don't play to prove anything to anyone. Another pause. Play for yourself. Play for the music itself. Forget about technique and finger positions and all those hours of practice. Just feel it. Maya stood there in the darkness, trying to process his words. How could she forget all her training? That training was all she had. Without it, without her carefully memorized finger positions and practiced movements, what was left? I don't understand, she admitted, her voice small. If I don't think about technique, how will I play the right notes? She heard what might have been a small chuckle from the maestro. That's exactly the question every true musician must answer for themselves. The notes are just the beginning, Miss Chen. They're not the destination. The concert hall fell silent again. Maya could feel everyone waiting. The other judges, the maestro, maybe even the cleaning staff who'd probably stopped their work to watch this unusual scene. Everyone wanted to see if this bold, foolish girl would actually try to pull this off. Maya adjusted her grip on her violin, feeling the familiar shape of it against her chin. She couldn't see it, but she knew every scratch, every imperfection in the varnish. This instrument had been her constant companion for so many years. Maybe that was enough. Maybe she didn't need her eyes after all. She lifted her bow, hovering it above the strings. Her hands were still shaking slightly, but something was starting to change inside her. In the darkness, with nothing to see and no way to rely on visual cues, she felt strangely calm. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff, that moment of absolute terror right before you decide to jump. Maya took a deep breath and let it out slowly. She thought about why she'd started playing violin in the first place. Not for auditions or conservatories or impressive performances. She'd fallen in love with the sound, with the way music could make her feel things she didn't have words for. Maybe that was what Maestro Rostov meant. Maybe she'd been so focused on playing correctly that she'd forgotten to play honestly. Whenever you're ready, the maestro said softly from somewhere in the darkness. Maya nodded to herself. She positioned her bow on the strings, feeling the slight resistance, the tension waiting to be released into sound. And then, with no idea if this would be her greatest triumph or most embarrassing failure, she began to play. The first note that came from Maya's violin surprised even her. It wasn't the careful, controlled sound she'd produced in her first performance. This note had weight to it. It had emotion. It seemed to come from somewhere deeper than just her fingers on the strings. In the darkness behind the blindfold, something strange was happening. Without her eyes to guide her, Maya's other senses suddenly became sharper. She could feel the vibrations of each note traveling through the wood of her violin, resonating through her collarbone, spreading through her entire body. The instrument wasn't just something she held anymore. It felt like an extension of herself. She continued playing, and with each phrase she noticed things she'd never paid attention to before. The way the acoustics of the massive concert hall picked up every subtle nuance, the slight echo that made each note linger just a moment longer, the way the air itself seemed to carry the sound, wrapping it around her like a blanket. Without being able to see her fingers, Maya stopped thinking about where they should go. She stopped calculating the distance between notes or worrying about exact positions. Her hands simply moved, finding the notes as if they'd always known the way. It was like her fingers were having a conversation with the violin, and she was just along for the ride. The melody began to flow in a way it never had before. Maya wasn't just playing the notes anymore. She was feeling them. She could sense the longing in certain phrases, the triumph in others. There were moments of desperation that made her bow press harder against the strings, and moments of hope that made her playing lighter, almost floating. She understood now what Maestro Rostov had meant. All those hours of practice had taught her the technical skills, but they'd also built walls around the music. She'd been so focused on playing it correctly that she'd forgotten to let it breathe. She'd been holding it prisoner instead of setting it free. In the judges' seats, Maestro Rostov sat forward, his eyes wide. He'd heard thousands of performances in his lifetime. He'd trained some of the world's finest musicians. But what he was hearing now made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. This wasn't the same girl who'd played just minutes ago. This was something else entirely. The other judges had stopped taking notes. They sat perfectly still, transfixed by what they were witnessing. One of them had tears forming in her eyes. Another gripped the edge of the table, leaning forward as if he couldn't bear to miss a single note. Maya moved through the variations with a freedom she'd never experienced. Those difficult passages that usually required intense concentration flowed naturally now. Her fingers danced across the strings without hesitation. It was like the music knew where it wanted to go, and all she had to do was trust it. She hit notes she'd always struggled with, finding them effortlessly. High notes that usually made her tense up came out pure and clear. Fast runs that normally required careful attention seemed to play themselves. Everything she'd fought so hard to achieve through practice was now happening without effort. The emotion in her playing grew stronger. Maya felt tears forming behind the blindfold, but she didn't stop. She let those feelings pour into the music. Every disappointment, every hope, every moment of doubt and determination, it all came through her bow. The violin sang with a voice that was entirely her own. She reached the section where the tempo picks up, where the notes come faster and faster until they blur together. In her first performance, she'd executed this part with mechanical precision. Now she let it explode from her instrument like fireworks. The notes tumbled over each other in a cascade of sound that filled every corner of the vast hall. Maya wasn't thinking about impressing anyone anymore. She wasn't worried about acceptance or rejection. In this moment, with the world blocked out by silk and darkness, there was only the music. It existed in its purest form, unfiltered by doubt or self-consciousness. The melody twisted and turned, climbed and fell, whispered and shouted. Maya's body swayed with the rhythm, her whole being caught up in the flow. She could feel the story that Paganini had woven into these notes, the struggle, the passion, the refusal to give up. It was her story too. Maybe that's why this piece had called to her in the first place. As she approached the final section, the impossibly fast sequence that had always terrified her, Maya didn't brace herself the way she usually did. She didn't tighten up or focus harder. Instead, she let go completely. She trusted her hands to know what to do. She trusted the music to carry her through. Her bow flew across the strings in a blur of motion. The notes came so fast they seemed to merge into a single sustained cry of triumph. It was wild and free and absolutely perfect in its imperfection. There were probably technical mistakes in there somewhere, tiny errors that a judge might mark down on a score sheet. But those mistakes didn't matter. They were part of the human element, the soul that Maestro Rostov had accused her of lacking. The final measures approached. Maya felt them coming not because she was counting or thinking ahead, but because she could feel the music reaching its natural conclusion. The energy that had been building throughout the piece needed release. It needed an ending that matched everything that had come before. She pulled every last bit of emotion from deep inside herself and channeled it through her bow. The notes rang out clear and strong, filling the enormous space with sound. And then in one final gesture, she held the last note. She held it until her bow trembled against the strings. She held it until the sound seemed to expand beyond the walls of the concert hall itself. And then silence. Maya stood perfectly still, her chest heaving, her body trembling from the intensity of what had just happened. Behind the blindfold, tears streamed down her face. She had no idea if she'd played well or terribly. She had no idea if she'd proven herself or confirmed the maestro's doubts. All she knew was that she'd just experienced something profound, something that had changed her understanding of what music could be. In the darkness, she waited for judgment. The silence stretched on forever. Maya stood frozen on the stage, still blindfolded, her violin hanging loosely in her trembling hand. She couldn't see anything. She couldn't tell if the judges were impressed or disgusted. She couldn't read their faces or gauge their reactions. All she could do was stand there in the darkness and wait. Her legs felt weak. Her shoulder ached from the intensity of her playing. Sweat had soaked through the back of her dress. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the deafening quiet that filled the concert hall. Why wasn't anyone saying anything? Had she been so terrible that they didn't even know how to respond? Then she heard it. A single pair of hands clapping. Slow. Deliberate. Each clap echoed through the vast space like a drumbeat. The sound was coming from where the judges sat. Maya's heart raced. Was this sarcastic applause? Was someone mocking her failed attempt? She wanted to rip off the blindfold and see what was happening, but her hands wouldn't move. Take off the blindfold. Miss Chen. It was Maestro Rostov's voice, but it sounded different somehow. Softer, almost gentle. Maya's fingers fumbled with the silk scarf. Her hands were shaking so badly it took her 3 tries to untie the knot. When the fabric finally fell away, she blinked rapidly as her eyes adjusted to the bright stage lights. Everything was blurry at first, just shapes and colors swimming together. As her vision cleared, Maya saw something that stopped her breath completely. Maestro Viktor Rostov, the man known throughout the music world for his harsh criticism and impossible standards, the teacher who never showed emotion, was standing, and he was smiling. Not just a polite smile, a real one. His whole face had transformed, and there in the corners of his eyes were tears. Actual tears glistening in the light. Before Maya could process what this meant, the other 3 judges rose to their feet. Their applause joined the maestro's, growing louder and more enthusiastic. The woman with the gray bun was clapping so hard her papers scattered to the floor. The man next to her had his hand over his mouth, shaking his head in amazement. But it didn't stop there. From the back of the concert hall, Maya heard more clapping. She looked past the bright lights and saw people she hadn't even known were there. Stage crew members had stopped their work to listen. Administrative assistants had paused in the doorways. Even a janitor stood in the far corner, his mop forgotten, applauding with everyone else. They were all clapping for her. For Maya Chen from a small town nobody had ever heard of. The girl who'd almost been sent home in disgrace just minutes ago. Maestro Rostov walked onto the stage. Each step seemed purposeful, measured. When he reached Maya, he stood there for a moment, just looking at her. His eyes were still wet, and he didn't try to hide it. In 40 years of teaching, he began, his voice thick with emotion, I have heard thousands upon thousands of auditions. I have trained dozens of students who went on to become concert soloists. I have worked with prodigies and virtuosos from every corner of the world. He paused, seeming to search for the right words. But what you just did, that was extraordinary. Maya felt her own tears spilling over. She tried to speak but couldn't form words. The maestro continued. When I criticized your first performance, I was absolutely right. It was technically proficient but emotionally empty. I've seen countless students exactly like that. Students who practice endlessly but never truly connect with the music. Most of them remain adequate musicians for their entire lives, nothing more. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. But what you just showed me is the mark of a true artist. When you removed your ability to see, when you stopped trying to control every single note, when you let go of your fear and your need for perfection, you found something most musicians spend their entire careers searching for. You found your voice. Maya's heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. Does this mean... She couldn't finish the sentence. She was too afraid of being wrong. Welcome to Richter Music Conservatory, Maestro Rostov said, his smile growing even wider. Full scholarship, every expense covered, and if you'll accept, I would like to take you on as my personal student. The applause erupted again, even louder this time. Maya heard cheers mixed in with the clapping. One of the assistant judges rushed over with admission papers. Another pulled out her phone to take a photo of this moment. Everyone seemed to want to be part of what had just happened. Maya couldn't stop crying. Happy tears, relieved tears, tears of disbelief. She'd come here this morning barely hoping for acceptance. Now she had a full scholarship and a chance to study under one of the greatest teachers in the world. It felt like a dream. She kept expecting to wake up on the bus, still hours away from the audition. Thank you, she managed to whisper. Thank you so much. Maestro Rostov leaned in closer, his voice dropping so only she could hear. I need you to understand something important. I push my students very hard. I criticize them, challenge them, sometimes make them want to quit. Do you know why? Maya shook her head, wiping her eyes. Because I see potential in them that they cannot see in themselves. When I told you that you would fail, I wasn't trying to crush your spirit. I was testing whether you had the courage to prove me wrong. Many students would have walked away. They would have accepted my judgment and given up on their dreams. He squeezed her shoulder gently. But you didn't. You demanded another chance. You risked everything on one moment of pure courage. That tells me more about who you are than any perfect performance ever could. Maya looked up at him, seeing the legendary maestro in a completely new light. He wasn't cruel or heartless. He was a teacher who cared so deeply about music that he couldn't settle for anything less than genuine artistry from his students. Never forget this moment, he said softly. Never forget what you discovered today. Your greatest strength doesn't lie in what you can see or control. It lies in your willingness to trust yourself, to be vulnerable, to feel deeply and honestly. That's what separates good musicians from great ones. The other judges surrounded them now, offering congratulations and asking questions about her background. Someone handed her a bottle of water. Another person wanted to schedule her first classes. The excitement swirled around her like a whirlwind, but through it all, Maya kept thinking about those words. About trust and vulnerability and honest feeling. About how sometimes you have to stop trying so hard to see the path ahead, and simply trust that your heart knows the way. She looked down at her violin, this worn instrument that had carried her through so much. It looked the same as it had this morning, but somehow everything had changed. She had changed. Maya Chen walked out of that concert hall with more than just an acceptance letter in her hands. She walked out understanding a truth that would shape her entire musical career and maybe her entire life. Sometimes the only way to truly see is to close your eyes.